Imagine a horrific triple murder, a town completely gripped by fear of a satanic cult, and a police investigation that declared its case wasn't just a 10 out of 10, but an 11. What happened next sparked one of the most controversial legal battles in modern American history. So today, we're not just going to look at a crime, we're using the case of the West Memphis Three to understand the hidden flaws in our own thinking and how they can lead just as terribly, terribly astray. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's May 6th, 1993. The bodies of three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, are discovered in a wooded area people called Robin Hood Hills. They were found naked, hogtied with their own shoelaces, and brutally murdered. I mean, the sheer violence of it just sent this shockwave of terror through this small conservative community. You know, what's really striking here is just how fast a story took hold. This was right at the height of the Satanic Panic in America, this period of, moral hysteria where rumors of ritual abuse were everywhere. So before any real evidence was even processed, the West Memphis police, who were under immense public pressure, had already latched onto this theory that this was a satanic ritual. This quote from the lead investigator, Gary Gitchell, it says everything, doesn't it? The police weren't just confident, they were absolutely certain. But this level of certainty, as we're about to see, was in complete opposition to the actual physical evidence, or really the lack of it. So the big question is, how could an investigation with that much certainty lead to a conviction that would be questioned by the entire world for decades? To get that, we first have to understand the environment that made it all possible. See, the seeds of this whole injustice, they weren't really planted at the crime scene. They were planted in the culture of the time. You gotta understand, the Satanic Panic was this huge thing happening all over the country. It created this powerful lens that people used to interpret shocking events. For a lot of people, it was just easier to believe in some dark, secret evil than to face the idea that this kind of violence could come from someone in their own community. And when you look at all this, you can see it was just a perfect storm of factors, right? You had sensationalist books, a real anxiety over social change, powerful religious TV broadcasts, and even law enforcement seminars, spreading these wild rumors that thousands were being killed by Satanists every year. West Memphis was just primed to believe this story. So, with this satanic theory already locked in their heads, the police really didn't have to look very far to find suspects who fit their narrative. So this is Damien Echols, and in a small conservative town, this kid was the definition of a social outcast. He wore a long black trench coat, had tattoos, read Stephen King, and was interested in Wicca, which, of course, everyone just confused with Satanism. He just didn't fit in, and that made him an immediate person of interest, way before any evidence pointed his way. Okay, so the actual case against Echols and his friend Jason Baldwin, it was completely circumstantial. There was nothing physical linking them to it. The key piece of evidence that led to their arrest came from Jesse Miskelly Jr. Police interrogated the 17-year-old who had a developmental disability for hours, and most of it wasn't even recorded. He eventually confessed and he implicated the other two. He took it back almost immediately, but by then, the damage was done. This confession was supposed to be the rock-solid foundation for the whole case. But look at this. It was just riddled with errors that totally contradicted the known facts. He got the time of day wrong, the boys were in school. He got the rope wrong, the cause of death wrong. Despite all of this, the prosecution just barreled ahead. So this brings up a really fascinating question, right? How can smart, dedicated professionals look at all these massive contradictions and still be so sure they've got the right guys? Well, the answer lies in the predictable and often flawed ways our brains are wired. The thing is, we all use cognitive biases every single day. They're basically mental shortcuts that help us make sense of a really complex world. And they're essential for us to function, but in a high-stakes situation like a murder investigation, they can be absolutely disastrous. Okay, so this model here, it basically shows how our minds decide who to blame. And man, it maps onto this investigation perfectly. It all starts with a prior belief. In this case, the police already believed it was a satanic crime. That belief totally shaped their perception of the whole situation. It created an expectation of what the killer would be like. So when they found Damien Echols, their perception of his behavior, wearing black, listening to heavy metal, it fit their expectation. And that led them to make a dispositional inference, which is a fancy way of saying they took a mental leap and decided his character, his disposition, was that of a killer, ignoring any other possibility. This is one of the biggest mental shortcuts we take.
We judge a situation based on how closely it resembles a prototype, a stereotype that we already have in our minds.
And for the people in West Memphis in 1993, Damien Echols fit that prototype to a T. He represented what they thought a satanic killer would look and act like. And that resemblance was so strong in their minds that it felt more real than the complete lack of physical evidence. Now, confirmation bias, this is the engine of tunnel vision. Once we have a theory that we like, our brain actively starts looking for evidence to support it. And what's really crucial is that it also ignores or downplays any evidence that contradicts it. And, well, that is exactly what happened here. The police took Echols' dark poetry and his Metallica t-shirts as proof of guilt. But meanwhile, they dismissed other major leads, like a report of a man covered in blood at a restaurant right near the crime scene, whose samples were somehow lost. And years later, DNA testing would even find hair at the scene matching one of the victim's stepfathers. But none of those leads fit the satanic cult story, so they were ignored. So, that first story, the one built on bias and a shaky confession, it worked. Damien Echols was sentenced to death, while Jason Baldwin and Jesse Misskelley got life in prison. But a new story was about to come out. The narrative started to crack, and it was largely thanks to this series of HBO documentaries called Paradise Lost, which brought the case to national attention. For the very first time, a huge audience saw just how flimsy the evidence was and the powerful biases that were at play. The film sparked this huge wave of support from celebrities and the public, which funded new legal challenges and DNA testing that just kept undermining the state's case. So after almost 2 decades in prison, with all this mounting evidence pointing to their innocence, the state was in a really tough spot. And their solution was a strange and, frankly, controversial legal maneuver. What they ended up doing in 2011 was taking something called an Alford plea. Now, this is a really strange legal tool. It allowed them to maintain their innocence, but they had to officially plead guilty. This meant they could walk free immediately, but it also protected the state from ever having to admit they did anything wrong or being held liable for a wrongful conviction. 18 years. Just think about that. An entire youth spent behind bars, with one of them on death row, for a crime they have always said they did not commit. You know, the story of the West Memphis Three is this tragic reminder that the biggest obstacles to justice aren't always corrupt officials or bad evidence. Sometimes the obstacle is the very wiring of our own brains. It forces us to ask a really tough question. If our minds are built to take shortcuts and just confirm what we already believe, what safeguards do we need to put in place